Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Chair Powell and Secretary Yellen for appearing today. A year ago, our economy and markets were roiled by COVID-19 and the government-ordered business shutdowns. We saw extraordinary turmoil in credit markets, and that turmoil threatened the ability of households and businesses, states and municipalities to obtain the credit that they needed. That kind of turmoil presented, in my view, the very real threat of a full-blown depression that could have taken years to recover from. In response, Congress passed the CARES Act to provide temporary relief to help the country weather a temporary storm. It was really an extraordinary response to an extraordinary situation. And thankfully, it proved remarkably effective, and we are now well on our way to a very strong recovery. The vaccine is being administered at a rate of over 2 million doses a day, states are reopening, and GDP is set to reach pre-pandemic levels at maybe as soon as this month, far earlier than either the CBO or the Fed originally projected. The economy has been in strong recovery mode since last summer, when we saw 38% GDP growth in the third quarter, and well before our Democratic colleagues enacted a $2 trillion spending blowout that had little to do with COVID. Congress must not use this pandemic as an excuse to permanently increase the size and role of the federal government. Congress certainly made this clear for the CARES Act emergency lending facilities. These facilities were established to stabilize turbulent credit markets so that households, businesses, states, municipalities could access credit. The intent was clear. The facilities funded by the CARES Act were to be temporary, to provide liquidity, and to cease operations no later than the end of 2020. These facilities were extremely successful in achieving their intended purposes of restoring liquidity in the private capital markets. And in the December COVID relief bill, Congress ensured that these facilities would in fact be wound down by the year end, as Congress had intended and the law required. They cannot be restarted or replicated in the future without congressional approval. In addition to Congress's swift response, the Fed's response last spring was massive and played a crucial role in our ongoing economic recovery. But as is the case with Congress, the Fed also must fight the urge to continue this response beyond its original purpose. Last March, the Fed lowered interest rates to nearly zero and initiated a record expansion of its balance sheet. This accommodation has remained, and by both official forecasts and market expectations, it's going to continue well beyond the point of full recovery. And that raises at least two concerns. The first concern is that the Fed's increased footprint is almost a permanent feature. And if this is the case and there's no eventual reduction in the size of the portfolio, then the Fed's quantitative easing to date would amount to a monetization of government debt. And I certainly hope that that's not the case. The second concern is that such an accommodative stance leaves our economy vulnerable to inflation. The Fed has signaled that its dovish monetary policy is here for a very long time. Its March summary of economic projections doesn't forecast any rate hikes until 2024 at the earliest, and the Fed appears to have no plans in place for reducing its monthly securities purchases. Given the current economic recovery and the recent increases in commodity prices, inflation expectations, and Fed communications, I do worry that the Fed may be behind the curve when inflation inevitably picks up. Final point and a warning. Very, very little of the Democrats' recent $2 trillion so-called American Rescue Plan had anything to do with COVID. It seemed more like a mad dash to claim credit for a recovery that was well underway and authorize as much money as possible to try to fundamentally remake our society to one where the state is at the center of life for many more Americans. It was a partisan, bloated spending bill. It contained stimulus checks for people with six-figure salaries who had no loss of income, expanded welfare benefits that eliminate incentives to work and minimize personal responsibility. There were reparations, as the chairwoman of the Senate Agricultural Committee called a loan forgiveness program that's based entirely on race and ethnicity. There were bailouts for chronically mismanaged states and cities despite their having record revenue in 2020 and $500 billion in addition that had already been provided by federal aid. And there was a federal plus-up of unemployment insurance that will pay about half of unemployed people more money not to work than they make working. In the long run, those kinds of policies will reduce productivity, diminish economic growth, and that in turn means a lower standard of living for all Americans. And it will exacerbate societal fractures. Fewer people will be paying taxes to support an ever-growing government, and those who do work will increasingly resent those who choose not to and yet enjoy the same or higher standard of living. That's unhealthy for the body politic, for our economy, and for our society writ large. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses and the question period later. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.